Does the Bible condone genocide? Many current atheists in the last 10 years have made claims against Christianity based on what they see as a kind of a horrific behavior of the God they see in the Old Testament.
Well, let's see. Does God call for the genocide of multiple people groups and or nations? Let's turn in our Bibles to Deuteronomy 20:16-18. However, in the cities of the nations the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them. The Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivitites, and Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded you. Otherwise they will teach you to follow the detestable things they do in worshiping their gods, and you will sin against the Lord your God. Well, shit, would you look at that? Seems like God does call for the genocide of multiple people groups. The word used here for completely destroy is most often used in relation to killing somebody or some group of people. In Joshua 6:21, we see this genocidal tendency come to fruition against the Canaanites. They devoted the city of the Lord and destroyed with the sword every living thing in it, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. These are not the only groups of people that are victims of God's genocidal tendency. In addition to the destruction of the Canaanites, Numbers 31:17-18 has this. Now, kill all the boys, and kill every woman who slept with a man, but save for yourselves every girl who has never slept with a man. Ah, yes, that's where God has commanded the deaths of everybody except for the young virgin girls. Obviously, this wasn't for sex trafficking reasons. The point is that the Bible is painfully obvious about God's genocidal tendencies. I'm really not sure how you can get around this fact.
They will typically point to the destruction of the Canaanites or the Amalekites, and they'll say, hey, how could God be so horrific to kill entire people groups? It appears to these folks that God is genocidal.
It's not that God just appears to be genocidal. God is genocidal. There is no appearing to be anything in this instance. He just is. Of course, J. Warner Wallace and other apologists like him think that God is good all the time, and
all the time, God is good.
That's right, honey. So obviously they must have deserved this eradication, right? God had the Midianites ethnically cleansed because they worshipped other gods and were enticing the Israelites to worship these other gods too. I mean, that's a good reason to eradicate an entire group of people, right?
How do we respond to that even quickly? Do we know enough about our Old Testament to be able to give a response at all?
Well, if the response is anything other than admitting that your God is a genocidal blood god, whose bloodlust will never be satiated until he becomes incarnate and causes other people to sacrifice himself to erase something that he created, then yeah, you don't really have a lot in the Old Testament to respond with.
Let me just give you a couple of quick ways to respond to that. First of all, it's always helpful, and especially in criminal trials that I'm involved in, to clarify terms, right? I mean, if we're not both on the same page, a defense attorney and a prosecutor can make two statements about the same term, and they can kind of both go over the heads of the jury because we haven't defined the term to begin with. What do we mean when we say genocide?
Oh, well, luckily there was an entire convention over this exact question in 1948 called the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, wherein Article 2 of this Genocide Convention states, any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such, A, killing members of the group. B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. D, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. And E, forcibly transferring children from the group to another group. Seems like the instances that we previously brought up with the Canaanites and the Midianites perfectly fit this definition of genocide. The destruction of the Midianites even had a forceful transfer of the children from one culture to another. So, seems like an open and shut case on the fact that the Bible describes God as a genocidal monster.
What are we saying when we say genocide? the entire destruction of an entire, it sounds like you just don't like that people group, and based on your bias and prejudice and hatred of that group, you decided to wipe the whole group out. Is that really what's being described in the Old Testament?
Well, the definition of genocide doesn't really speak to motive. It really only describes the action of genocide. But I'm kind of curious, is there any motive whatsoever that would justify genocide to you? But even so, God did have a prejudice and a bias and a hatred against the groups that he commanded the Israelites utterly destroy. Another thing is that the definition of genocide doesn't strictly mean that the entire population group has to be destroyed. It could be destroyed in whole or in part. It kind of seems like former Detective Wallace here is importing information into the criteria to determine whether or not a genocide has been committed in order to argue that there is no genocide in the Bible.